Welcome back for part 2 of the Native Americans social studies that we're doing here in the first quarter. When we met last time, we talked about the Native Americans and how they are the indigenous people. We talked about their culture. We dug a little bit into their tribes and the way that that was broken down into clans and families. We studied the roles of men and women in the society. We talked about their form of government or lack thereof and their laws. We talked about the way children were treated and what they did in their lives. And we briefly hinted at some of the things that we're going to look at in here today. And many of these things are what you are probably researching and working on for in some of the artifacts. Not all of them will be mentioned, but some will be mentioned here. Again, if we remember from the last time, we studied that the first people to live in the land are called indigenous peoples. The first people to live in a land are called indigenous peoples, and the Native Americans are the indigenous peoples of the United States. And we're going to take a little bit deeper look into their culture, into their history, and some of the things that they did in their day-to-day lives. Now, to dig into their history, it's a little bit different from us. We can't just jump into the library and break out some encyclopedias and start looking into the history that was written down. We can't unroll some scrolls. The Native Americans really didn't do a lot of writing down of their history, at least on paper. They weren't writing down their history. And we have to find out about their history in other ways. So archaeologists are people who study they study the past by digging up artifacts. And they learn a lot of things by digging up these artifacts. They learn a lot of things about other cultures that lived in the past. And they'll look at these tools, these weapons, these artifacts, and they'll put all of those things together and start having a little bit better understanding of what these people did in the past. We can learn also, now if we remember when we talked about last time how kids don't go to school, but what they did have to do is sit and listen to those stories by the fire, and those stories were like the oral history that was being passed down by the elders. So we can learn from the traditions and the stories that have been passed down through the tribes from generation to generation. So let's take a little bit of a look at Native American art. I know a lot of you have chosen to do different art projects in the class, and that's great. I will in no way cover every art that they have. I'm just going to touch on a few of the major ones. There were so many Native American tribes across North America, and they each had, like we already said in the last time, they had their very unique laws and they had their own culture. And in that uniqueness, they also developed very unique art forms as well. So the art would differ from tribe to tribe. And it was only the Native Americans that settled in an area for a long period of time that had lots of art, at least art that archaeologists are able to dig up and actually look into. Those that moved around a lot didn't typically have time to pursue any arts and crafts. They were more focused on day-to-day survival and keeping their mobility up. One of the most common arts, as you can see here, was pottery. I don't think that's really some pottery there. I'm going to have to change that. Tribes made pottery because it had uses to hold. They were containers. Containers are very important things in the art of survival. But they also made sure that much of the art was very beautiful. Art and pottery pieces were decorated. They had very important religious symbols. They had many animals that they either worshipped or were very important to the cultures. And many times, like I said, they may not have written things down on paper, but they recorded historical events and very important things onto their pottery through painting. They didn't just have pottery, and I can't imagine anyone is going to try to take this one on in the classroom. But in addition to pottery, Native Americans had basket weaving. And the basket weaving, again, differed from culture to culture. But it was very common among Native American women to spend that time pulling the grasses and the reeds up and weaving them into baskets. Much like the pottery, baskets are another type of container, and containers are one of the main important things if you are trying to survive. While it is not an extensive list of things that you need to survive, there are many people that subscribe to the 5 C's of survival. And all of these things happen to start with C. Many people, when they're trying to survive, most definitely need some sort of a cutting tool. So Native Americans had knives. To be able to survive, you need some sort of combustion device. Now, remember last time that we studied, we learned that the Native American women were responsible for keeping the fires lit around the tribes and also keeping those fires lit in the houses that smoke the meats. So you have to have a combustion device. You need cover. We learned that was the men and the women that were responsible for keeping cover, and depending on where you lived, what type of shelter you lived in, it could have been a longhouse, could have been a teepee, or it could have been a Pueblo, but everyone in the village was responsible for cover. Another of the 5 C's, the fourth of the 5 C's, is cordage, something that you can use to bind things and tie things together, kind of like rope. Again, imagine trying to put a teepee together with nothing to tie things together with, or to be able to weave clothing without any type of thread or string. You really do need some type of cordage to survive. And again, that 5th C that you look at many times is container. So building these baskets and designing those pots was not just something they did as an artistic expression, although there was artistic expression weaved in those. As you can see here, they're weaving those different things, those whether it's religious symbols or historical facts. The big use out of those things was they are containers, and it's extremely, extremely important. Blankets, yet another item made by Native Americans that had multiple uses, and they were also very artistic. There was artistic expression inside of the weaving of the blanket, but as we know, a blanket can be used for cover, one of those 5 C's. It can keep you warm. And blankets also had very special symbols woven into them as well. It could be something of a religious nature, or it could be something telling historical facts. It could be notifying other people of a specific tribe based on the colors and the patterns. But again, I think the big reason why they made blankets was for what anyone else would need a blanket for, and that is to keep warm. I think everyone's favorite, at least the reaction we had in class of all of the different types of artwork that we looked at, and I completely understand this one, is the totem poles. Now, totem poles had all of these different faces and symbols that were carved into them. And sometimes it may be the face or the animal symbol of specific family members. And it could be like their spirit animal. We haven't gotten into the religion. I'm not too sure that we'll have time to do that, but if we can, we will. As you can see, some of these totem poles in the backgrounds had huge beaks and giant wings. And we can get into some of these legends and the myths that were spoken about in Native American history, because they're very interesting to talk about it. And essentially, and this is a very neat, I like the way they put that here, totem poles were used to tell stories. They were like the story books. So instead of going to the library, you could go and look at these like 100-foot tall picture books and learn things about your history and learn stories about your great-grandparents or historical facts and things that happened in the past. Totem poles are very, very interesting, and I understand why quite a few of you chose totem poles as your artifact that you're going to create this coming up week. Native American clothing. Well, again, if we keep looking at those 5 C's, you got to have some kind of cover, and that could be bodily cover as well. And not a shock here, depending on where you live, the clothing that you had changed. If you lived somewhere where it was very, very cold, like the Inuits in Alaska, you had very thick fur clothing. If you lived in like super southern Florida where it was warm all the time, you probably had very little clothing because it was hot all the time and you don't need giant thick furs. So where you lived, what you wore would change. So, and it also like depends on what kind of resources are available to you as well. It also depends on the time of year. And I know coming up in a slide or two here, we're probably going to really blow some minds, because it's not a shock to say I went out and killed a deer and I tanned the hide and made it very soft and made some pants and the shirt out of it. But some of the other things they did are actually kind of out there. Again, the most common thing for Native Americans were animal skins. They would tan the hides. They would make the leather very soft. They would shape and cut and sew the leather together in order to make themselves clothing and shoes. We also know that that's something they used buffalo to cover their teepees as well. That's a massive animal if you think about it, to cover those giant teepees. They also used plants. Now, I really wish we had the time to dig into this and kind of figure out how in the world they did this, but they would take bark off a tree, dry it, they would shred it, get all of those fibers, almost like you're making paper, and weave it into different items like skirts and hats and caps and aprons. And I definitely am intrigued by this one. I want to dig a little bit more into this. As a matter of fact, I think it would make a fantastic podcast once we get those up and rolling in the classroom. Later in time, Native Americans began to grow cotton, which is, a lot of us probably have clothes on today that are made of cotton, some of it even 100% cotton. We probably have some wool. I know my favorite socks that I have are 100% wool, and it's very exciting to have that. This one's a little scary here. They even use human hair sometimes to weave into fabrics. That's kind of gross. Please do not make a shirt out of human hair. I do not want to see that as an artifact. They would decorate the clothing, again, with religious and historical meanings behind them, whether that was shells and feathers and animal teeth. So I'm going to have a hard time catching my train of thought, and I know for you it's like right in the second, but about 6 people just came in my room. So I'm going to start this one over. Again, when Native Americans started to grow cotton and they started to grow things like, or not grow wool, but use wool in their clothing, which is something we're probably familiar with, they would also weave in things like beads and shells and feathers to make it more fancy. Now, sometimes it was just to make their clothes more beautiful. Sometimes it had a specific reason. It might be, I'm part of this tribe, or because I have this many feathers, I am a wife to this person, or because I have this many antlers, that means I'm a very skilled hunter. So it had different meanings in the clothing, and we can look those up at a different time, or if you want to look those up on your own, that's fantastic, especially if you're doing clothing as one of your artifacts. Native American homes, there were different types of Native American homes, but there were probably 3 main types of homes. We had the teepee, the one we're all familiar with, the Longhouse, the one we tried to build in the back of Friendship with my lumberjills a few years ago, and the Pueblo, which is, I think we'll get to on one of the last slides we talk about today. Here's your teepee, the one that we're all most familiar with, the ones that we've seen in movies, the ones that we would draw if we were asked to be drawing Native Americans at their homes. And you can see it comes from the Lakota word, teepee, which means a dwelling, where you live. These tent-shaped things were covered with buffalo skins. Now, you got to imagine, this is a pretty massive, like 10 to 12 foot tall structure, and it's not one buffalo that's going to cover that. So they had to kill quite a few buffalo and tan the hides in order to have a cover for their home. And the thing about teepees that was very unique is they were designed to move quickly, break it down and move quickly. Now, you might notice right here, I can open up this flap. That means if it's a winter time, I can have a fire on the inside, and this kind of acts like a chimney, bringing the smoke out. If it's not having a fire, I can close the flap back down, keep all of the air inside, and keep it nice at a nice regulated temperature. This is the Longhouse. This is what we were trying to build out back, and we realized real quick, holy cow, we have 0 Native American skills when we were with the lumberjills. We did our best. Now, if we'd have been able to cut down a whole lot more trees, we may have been able to cover up with some bark like this, but they were huge, 200 feet long, 20 feet wide, and families, multiple families lived inside. It's almost like an apartment complex. You can see here as many as 60 people could live in one Longhouse. And last, before the time runs out, the last Native American home is the Pueblo. So it looks like we'll pick up next time with homes and review those, since this part got kind of sped through. But the Pueblos were built out of clay, earth, water, and straw.